Good morning. Welcome to Adult Forum. Happy New Year. We are very pleased to have with us once again one of our congregation members, Reverend Dr. Christian Wilson. There are a couple of you that may not have been around a few weeks ago when he led our class on some of the history and sources of how we ended up with the books in the Bible that we called the Apocrypha. And having given that introduction, today he's going to lead us on some of the things that we can learn or be inspired by from the Apocrypha. My guess is few of us have ever heard a Bible study or a sermon on these topics before, so potentially unique opportunity. Welcome.
Thank you, Nelson. In 336 AD, or BC, sorry, Alexander the Great began his conquest. His conquest covered all of Greece, then moved east, conquered all of the massive Persian Empire. That conquest included Egypt, it included Israel, Jerusalem, all of the ancient Near East, the modern day Middle East, all into the Persian Empire, and all the way to the banks of the Ganges River. With him, Alexander brought Greek culture, Greek ways of doing things, and most importantly, the Greek language. Alexander died unexpectedly at the age of 33 in 323 BC. He had no male heir of age to take his position. His empire was divided among his generals, and two of those generals and their successors are important for our study today. One of the empires, one of the kingdoms, they would be called, one of the new kingdoms was the Seleucid Kingdom, named after Alexander's general Seleucus I. One of them was the Ptolemaic Empire, named after Alexander's general Ptolemy I. Each of these generals now become kings, started a lengthy dynasty. During the first 100 years of this period, and the period is known as the Hellenistic period, that is Greek-like, Greek ways, Hellenistic culture pervaded what the new kingdoms of what had been Alexander's empire. During the first part of this Hellenistic period, one of the problems about Jerusalem in particular, Israel in general, is its location. It is on the corner, the dividing line between three continents. If you want to conquer somebody else, you're probably going to have to go through Israel to get there in the ancient world. And Jerusalem seems to be so often throughout history right on that fault line of history. And that was the case in the time period that we're going to talk about, which is the 160s through 130s BC. The Ptolemies ruled Jerusalem and the surrounding areas of Judah, the areas of the Jews during the first part of the Hellenistic period. Jews were abundant, particularly in Alexandria. They all spoke Greek. Greek was the international language. The international language, even to a much greater extent than what English is the international language today. And excuse me, to get along in the world, you needed to speak Greek. All 2 million Jews in Alexandria all spoke Greek. By first century, you will have the greatest Jewish philosopher of the ancient world, Philo of Alexandria, who can't speak any Hebrew at all. Greek is the language. Greek is more and more the culture. You find a high priest named Jason. You have this sort of slow influx of Greek culture. In 200 BC, the new king of the Seleucids, Antiochus IV, began to move troops south to conquer Judea, Jerusalem, and conquer just about all of Egypt, well into Africa. Antiochus IV was a staunch Hellenist. He believed in Greek culture and believed that all other culture was bad. He believed in Greek religion, and all other religion was false. He hated the Jewish religion and didn't care much for the Jewish people. Antiochus took upon himself an honorific name. He began to call himself Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means, well, we just had the Christian day of Epiphany, the festival of Epiphany. It means manifestation, and specifically manifestation of God. Antiochus IV Epiphanes saw himself as the manifestation, the physical manifestation of the Greek god Zeus. He wanted everybody else to see that too. He had military parades, we are told, in which he would, of course, ride at the end of the parade on his great white steed, and all of the crowd would bow to him and say, "Hail Antiochus Epiphanes! Hail Antiochus Epiphanes!" When I used to teach this to undergraduates, I would have the class stand up, and the whole class we would do that say. But some of the people, instead of saying, "Hail Antiochus Epiphanes," would say, they would act like their Greek wasn't quite so good, and they would say, "Hail Antiochus Epimanes." Epimanes means madman. And that is what Antiochus, that was a more apt description of Antiochus. After Antiochus conquered Jerusalem, he began to, in a series of laws, outlaw the practice of Judaism. He outlawed possession of Jewish books, of the Torah. He outlawed observance of the Sabbath day. He outlawed the Jewish festivals. He well, it wasn't even that gradually. He wanted to eliminate all traces of Judaism. And when I say he outlawed these things, it was not if you got caught possessing Jewish books, they would be confiscated and you would be slapped on the wrist. No, it was capital punishment. Antiochus went too far, it seems, when he outlawed circumcision. And he had his soldiers inspect Jewish babies to see whether they had been circumcised, baby boys. If the baby boy had been circumcised, the baby boy was killed on the spot. And this is where on the TV news they say the next part may be sensitive information. They beware. After they killed these Jewish baby boys, they would take little ropes, string them up by their shoulders, and the mothers were made to wear their dead babies around their necks until the bodies of the babies began to decompose. He wanted in every conceivable way to eventually, this was all in 168 BC. Eventually, by 167 BC, Jewish people had enough of Antiochus Epiphanes, and a small group from a father and 5 sons from outside of Jerusalem, out in a rural town. The town's name, I think, is just as rural a name as you want to get. The father and sons lived in the town called Modine. The father and sons their surname was Maccabee. The father was Mattathias. The 5 sons were John, Judas, Eleazar, Jonathan, and Simon. And they would, all be involved in the revolt. Mattathias and his sons decided to revolt against Seleucid rule. The revolt initially had some success. They grew together. It was a little bit of a ragtag force, but they grew together force enough, and with guerrilla fighting techniques, they were able to make advances on the Seleucid troops. Then the Seleucids decided it was time to bring in the heavy artillery. The Seleucids, in fact, had the ultimate weapon of the world. Know what the ultimate weapon of the ancient world is? Don't hear any guesses.
Fire.
I'm sorry?
Greek fire.
No, I don't, yeah, Greg, you'll have to explain all that one to me.
Elephant.
Elephants. They had trained elephants with Indian drivers. They would put towers on top of the elephants with the driver and with warriors who would shoot their arrows and throw their spears. The elephant itself is, we have another name for them. We call them pachyderms. Pachyderm is two Greek words, thick and skin. Elephants are so thick-skinned that the arrows and spears of the Maccabean defenders would not pierce the skin of the elephants. So he brought in the commander brought in a large group of elephants, and the Maccabees were losing the battle badly. In the wake of this terrible force, one of the Maccabee brothers, Eleazar, knew something about elephants. Knew that there was a place where the elephants were vulnerable, and that is their soft underbelly. About soft underbelly myself. He knew that the underbelly of the elephant was the only place where the skin was thin enough to be pierced. Eleazar took his sword and dashed under the elephant, slashed it open, blood pouring everywhere, the smell of the blood sending other elephants into, made them go crazy, and through some of their riders, chaos was resulting, and the Seleucids were now in great fear. Of course, this had one very unfortunate effect for Eleazar himself. He was the Seleucids went on eventually to win the battle, but Eleazar became the hero, the martyr. And really, for the first time, you developed in Judaism a kind of cult of the martyr, belief that martyrs, the actions of the martyrs, benefit, even though they died, they benefited the cause of the Jews. Much of this material, not all of it, is recorded in the book of First Maccabees. And fighting went on. Eventually, the Maccabee brothers, now 4 of them left, under the leadership of Judas Maccabee, took possession of Jerusalem from the Seleucids in 165 BC. Antiochus had done another thing that I neglected to mention. While he was in Jerusalem, he did, in his effort to destroy everything having to do with Judaism, he ransacked the temple. His people took down the altar to the Hebrew God, to Yahweh, and replaced it on the altar with something that in First Maccabees is called the abomination of desolation. The term is also used, I think, in Daniel. Isn't it, Linda? Yeah, okay. Linda's always, if there's any, Linda Daniel's always interested in anything from the book of Daniel. And the term reoccurs in the New Testament in Mark 13 and its parallels. We don't know exactly what the abomination of desolation was, but in all likelihood, and from some later Christian and Jewish writings, we gather that it was a idol sculpture of the Greek god Zeus, and that the Jews would be required to worship in their own temple. They would be required to worship Zeus. It is also said, I think, by one later ancient historian, that this statue of Zeus bore a remarkable resemblance to Antiochus himself. So the Maccabees retook Jerusalem 165 BC, tore out the abomination of desolation, took on purifying rites for the temple to make it Jewish again. The purifying rites are 8 days, took 8 days, according to the laws of the Torah. And these 8 days, a later legend, not in First Maccabees, it was said that the oil for the lamps in the temple, they had only 1 day's supply, but that 1 day supply extended for 8 days, for the full 8 days of the purification. And you may know all of this in the Jewish festival that is celebrated to this day, the 8 days of Hanukkah. Well, it wasn't the end of the Seleucids. They would come back. The rest of First Maccabees is an exceedingly complex story of how the Jews survived. Much of the way they survived during this Seleucid period was because the Seleucids themselves were fighting among one another. There were rival dynasties, rival claimants to the throne, who would go to war with one another. Some Jews did not side with the Maccabees, but went to war with one or another of the Seleucid factions. Also, the Seleucids always had a king. Sometimes they had 2 kings. The Jews did not have a king. The Maccabees, now the chief leader was Judas Maccabee, would not crown himself king. Why would Judas not be a king?
Bad history.
I'm sorry.
Bad history of prior.
Well, that is true. No, you got to be king of the Jews. You have to be from the tribe of Judah, from the family of David, a descendant of David. And the Maccabees were not from the tribe of Judah. They were from the priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi. or he's in Durham, we call him Levi. And he made himself, Judas did, high priest, and began to rule like a king, but with the title high priest. And he would establish a dynasty of high priest kings that would rule over the Jews when they finally became independent. I'm not going to trace the rest of the story of First Maccabees. It is complex, particularly on the Seleucid side. Reread it this week, found myself taking pages of notes, just trying to separate out one pretender to the throne from another pretender to the throne. Who it makes for, well, you can read it. There are also 3 other books of the Maccabees. Second Maccabees, which covers the same time period, but is more theological. God is much more involved in. And then there are third and fourth Maccabees, which are later praised for the Maccabean family and their revolt. As the war, well, they had 165, they had taken Jerusalem. The Seleucids would take it back. There would be continual warfare. Judas would be killed in battle. He was then succeeded by Jonathan. And when you read these warriors, these are bloody. How does that sound? I mean, I know when I read things like in Joshua where they kill whole cities, and it's pretty rough. But these the stories of the Maccabees, they are they're Jewish heroes, but they are cruel warriors. There are massacres of Seleucid cities where they just kill everybody. They are extremely violent. So Jonathan takes over, is just about as ruthless as Judas had been. John is killed in battle. Jonathan is eventually killed in battle. Finally, in 134 BC, Simon becomes high priest, and the war is essentially over. Israel, Judah will become an independent nation for the first time since 586 BC. In 132 BC, so about 400 years. Yes, Nelson.
You mentioned the ways that the signs of being Jewish were being purged and outlawed. Did that go as far as the library in Alexandria?
Well, the library in Alexandria, the answer is no. The Seleucids, while they controlled Alexandria, the library at Alexandria was one of the great Hellenistic achievements. It contained, while it contained the Septuagint, that was one book, and a few other Jewish books. That was one of 400,000 books. And so I think it probably went unnoticed, but no, the Seleucids were proud of the library at Alexandria. The Jews ruled themselves from this time, first time in 400 years, from 134 down to 63 BC. The Jews had been conquered before by all the ancient empires, again, largely because of their location on the way to somewhere else. The Assyrians wanted to conquer Egypt. They conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. The Babylonians conquered what was left, conquered the southern kingdom. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, and then the Persians ruled. The Greeks conquered the Persians, and then they ruled. And then the Hellenistic kingdoms, Seleucid and Ptolemy, ruled over Judah, Jerusalem, all the way down to 132. From 132, some people would say from 143, when Jonathan does regain the temple, but the fighting is still going on. From 132 down to 78 BC, Judea is an independent kingdom. Jews have a nation. They haven't had one in 400 years. In 63 BC comes the mightiest empire of them all, Romans. And the Romans will conquer the Jews, control Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be, I won't go through the list of empires that will rule Jerusalem from that point on. It's about 7 or 8 different empires from that point on down to 1948. Well, in terms of the old city of Jerusalem itself, down until 1948, the Jews will have their own nation again after 2,000 years. And finally, in 1967, in the Six-Day War, they will retake the ancient. Now, you might ask, where is God in all of this? First Maccabees is remarkably secular history. God is mentioned a few times, maybe 3. One of the Second Maccabees, not written by the same person, one of the objects of Second Maccabees is to make is to make it all religious. And so God enters frequently in all the events as described in Second Maccabees. So that's the story of the Maccabean Revolt. And I'm going to stop for your questions now, and then we may talk a little bit more about Hellenism and the Jews and the early Christians. What other questions, comments do you have? Miguel left. There he's gone. Okay. Miguel and Amy, I think you're inside now. You were outside all summer long. Okay.
It's winter. I think he's just going to get a book or his new lenses to read. But yeah, this is fascinating. I actually I have an old Bible that I liked as a kiddo that was a RSV version, and they don't have, it's a Metzger was the editor, and anyway, there aren't many of them. And the Div School used to use something like this, the Oxford version, and now I get it.
My era.
Yeah. And now when I got it online, it comes with the Apocrypha, which I wasn't very familiar until your Sunday school. So this has been the adult forum this has piqued my, interest in learning, obviously, about God and his relation, with Israel and with humanity. Although this is a little gory, I must admit, what you're describing. Yet it is, I guess one might say, rather inspiring to think that from a few people, God always has a remnant and is wanting to, I guess, bring renewal. But I must admit, who does Jerusalem? That is a sticky topic, as well as, should it be like a Geneva nation that it's not necessarily anyone's, or is it God's? That's another topic.
In my view, it should.
Okay.
That never seems to happen, never seems to be in the offing.
Yeah. But I'd like to dig deeper. Thank you so much. This is a lot to chew on.
Questions, comments? I mentioned that about the Apocrypha, that the books of the Apocrypha cover more or less the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That it's the Old Testament, the last book in our, and the order of the books in the Old Testament varies from, it's a different order in the Septuagint, it's a different order in the Jewish Bibles, it's a different order in Roman Catholic Bibles. In our Bibles, the last book of the Old Testament is Malachi, the last of the prophets, and it's about 440 BC is when it ends. So we cover this but more or less cover this in between period with the books of the Apocrypha. Questions or thoughts?
What do you call this? The Middle Age Testament?
It would be an appropriate term. Middle Testament, perhaps. It's the last time I made something of a plea for Protestants to include the Apocrypha in our Bibles. And that was before I reread First Maccabees. I don't know. There are things as bloody, almost at times you wonder if books of the Apocrypha are just trying to get it a little bit more bloody than what's in the Old Testament. There's a story in the Old Testament in Judges, the 4th and 5th chapters of the book of Judges, where there is a battle against the Canaanites, battle between the Jews and the Canaanites, and the Canaanites are defeated. The Canaanite general Sisera escapes. He goes and is hidden out in a tent by a Jewish woman whose name is hard for most of us to pronounce. Jael, Hebrew would be Yael. Yahweh is God is what it means, but Yael. Do you remember what she did? Yeah, you got it, friend. Friend did a motion. Yael, while Sisera was exhausted and asleep, hammered a hole through his head and killed him. Now that's pretty gory. But when the Apocrypha, we have the book of Judith. And Judith, the story is similar. The villain, Judith's villain, is named Holofernes, and Judith will cut his head off and hold and parade his head, blood coming down from his head, walking around. And of course, she too is a great hero of the faith. And that will become, in medieval art, there are numerous representations of Judith holding the head of Holofernes. So
That's not too much different than David with the head of Goliath.
yeah, David did the same thing. When I was growing up, that was one of the first Bible stories I heard was David and Goliath, and I knew about. It was explained to me that it was not a slingshot like that, but that a sling like this that David threw and killed Goliath, and that's when the story ended. When I was told it in Sunday school, it was only later that I read it for myself and found that David cut off the head of Goliath. Some of these Bible heroes could be more like I want them to be. The ancients wish that the prophets could be more like we want them to be. Sometimes the Bible is very upsetting. Other questions, comments? Have some time.
Were the Maccabees okay with the people from the tribe of Judah being the king, or did they want to be the kings themselves or be the rulers themselves?
Well, they functioned as kings. The people from the tribe of David would never become kings. Judah would never have another king until this day. There is no king. Jesus was from the line of David, and Jesus was king in a spiritual sense. Talk about the Maccabees as priests who acted like kings. We have another, I don't want to say that Judaism is diversified in the first, second century BC. There are Jews who don't favor the Maccabean descendants. Incidentally, the name of the Maccabean dynasty is called the Hasmonean Dynasty, named after Hasmon, who was Mattathias, the grandfather of the Maccabee brothers, the father of Mattathias Maccabee. So it's the Hasmonean Dynasty. We have, for example, a group. We knew very little about them until 1947 through 1956. A group that described themselves as sons of light, group of Jews. They were described by other Jews as Essenes. They went out and lived in the desert, and for the next 150 years at least, and they moved to the desert during the time of Maccabean Revolt. They did not, well, they don't ever mention the Maccabees. They have their own high priests. They are waiting for a Messiah to come. Messiah being someone from the line of David. The Maccabees, the Hasmonean Dynasty, they're not waiting for that. You know, they're it. The theory, and I think it's a correct one, is that the Dead Sea Scrollers, the Essenes, went into the desert because and lived as separate, almost monastic community, because the Hasmonean Dynasty, the Maccabees and their descendants, while they had proclaimed themselves as high priest, and while they were of the tribe of Levi, they were not from the right family. You can be a priest if you're from the tribe of Levi. If you're not from the tribe of Levi, you can't. It's not like you can go to Levi Divinity School or become a Levite. You can't. You have to be born. You have to be born a priest. The Essenes believed that the high priest had to come not only from the tribe of Levi, but from the family of the first high priest, whose name was Zadok. And the Maccabees were not from the line of Zadok. Therefore, the Essenes rejected their authority, and the Essenes waited in the desert for the Messiah to come. Well, actually, they were hoping for two Messiahs to come, one priestly, one royal Messiah, priestly, one from the line of Aaron, the family of Zadok, and a royal one from the line of David. It was, well, they waited for the Messiah, and what they got instead was the Romans destroyed their community in it's the Romans. So and I should note that some of the books of the Apocrypha, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of our oldest manuscripts of the Old Testament come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the finds that were made in caves about 8 miles from Jerusalem by the Dead Sea. These manuscripts, which cover every book in the Bible except one, the book of Esther, also cover a number of books of Apocrypha. I mentioned Tobit last time. We've got 22 manuscripts of Tobit, mostly in slightly more in Aramaic than in Hebrews, but in both of those languages among the Dead Sea Scrolls. One book of the Apocrypha that we do not find among the Dead Sea Scrolls is, guess what? Oh, First Maccabees, no, Second Maccabees. The Dead Sea Scrollers didn't want anything that out of the Maccabees, whom they regarded as illegitimate high priest. Let me mention one other thing. We mentioned the last time the making of the Septuagint, the Greek New Testament, that became the New Testament for a while of, well, really until the time of Christ, was the principal, not New Testament, Greek Old Testament, I'm sorry, Greek Old Testament, became the Old Testament writing of the Jews. They also became Bible of the earliest Christians. Sometimes when you read, you may read a quotation in the New Testament, and if you look up in the Old Testament, then you say you've got a reference in the footnote or side note in your Bible to where that Old Testament quotation comes from. If you look back, you'll find that it is might be somewhat different in the Old Testament. The reason is our Old Testaments are RSV, like Amy had, or the new RSV, and most are based on Hebrew scriptures, not the Septuagint. The New Testament writers, though, when they just read the Septuagint, they spoke Greek, they wrote in Greek, they quoted from the Greek Bible, and sometimes Bible is or I feel like I've given a lot of information. Are there other things that I might be able to clarify? Yes, Nelson.
I doubt many of us are well informed on differences between Reform versus conservative temples, but I'm wondering your distinction of what it takes to be a priest. Are there any highly conservative strands of Judaism that still only want to hear from a priest that can trace his lineage back to a certain tribe?
Not a priest. After year 70 changed everything. In the year 70, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. The function of the priest, what the priest did, they were no longer ruling after 78 BC when the Romans took, or 63 BC when the Romans took over. The function of the priest, the principal function of the priest, some would say the only function of the priests, was to offer the sacrifices in the temple. Sacrifices could be made only in the temple. And there were orders of priests. You can read some about this in the first chapter of Luke, that made sacrifices were made all day long for animal sacrifices for individual people, for the whole nation. And they, when the temple was destroyed, there was no place to make sacrifices. Since making sacrifices was the only thing the priests did, there were no more priests. There are no more priests to this day. That's in all sects of Judaism. Priest. We don't have priests, we have rabbis. And rabbis are teachers. The word means teacher. Jesus is called a rabbi. Rabbis, after the destruction of Jerusalem, one very important rabbi, brilliant rabbi named Yohanan ben Zakkai, organized a council that became a school down in the little coastal town of Jamnia, Yavna in Hebrew, on the Mediterranean coast of Israel. And that school reinvented Judaism. And Judaism, the successors became the rabbis who would write elaborating on the Jewish law, write what would eventually become the principal Jewish books, the Talmud. 22 volumes of arguments, legal arguments about matters of the law. And so over that course of time, between the destruction of the temple in 70 and Jamnia 90, 100, 110, from being a religion of priests and sacrifice to becoming a religion of rabbis and law. And I could say also that the temple was replaced by the synagogue. We already had synagogues, but the synagogue became the important place of worship. Now, I know it gets confusing because you see Jewish synagogues today, and they're usually titled, Temple, Temple Bethel. But I can assure you they don't make animal sacrifices there. So, and that's the idea of some very small minorities, is that someday the temple, the third temple, be built on the ruins right there where the Dome of the Rock is now in Jerusalem, where the second temple, Herod's temple, had been, and where Solomon's temple had been. Third temple will be built, and then they'll have priests again, and then they'll make sacrifices again. Of course, if that were to happen, you would have a very bad war with both Arabs and Jews. Well, our time is about up. Any other thing I could make clearer? 1 minute. Well, I'm grateful for y'all being here, and we'll let's just end in a word of prayer. God, we give you thanks for the books that have been written that tell us these stories. We give you thanks for the perseverance of the Jews throughout history. We give you thanks for our blessed Jesus Christ, who sprang from, and for this day of the festival of the baptism, of the baptisms we will have. Here's Nelson.
As is our tradition, here's your chance to unmute yourself and express your thanks for learning so much today.
Thank you very much. It was really great.
Yes, thank you so much.
Just waiting and saying thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Come back next week. We will hear again from Jonathan Hamrickson. He's a PhD student here at Duke. Some of you heard from him a few years ago when he was letting us know about the St. John's Bible. And I think we'll be hearing a bit about that and his experiences and learning of calligraphy and some work he's done with the Song of Songs. In competition with today's speaker for having paid tuition for what, 17 years?
But he probably paid more in tuition in 1 year than I did in all of that.
He may have paid more dollars in tuition, but he is being schooled by the same institution that led to the knowledge we heard today. Hope you all have a good week and very much.